My name is Karen Hennessy and I work here at the Contemporary Music Centre, and I just want to thank you all for coming and to welcome you all here today to this session. So we're delighted to be hosting this here, and we're delighted to be working with the Music Generation on the session. And we've been having many conversations with Music Generation around this area that we're looking at today. And in particular, I'd like to thank Eve O'Kelly for all of the work that she's done on this morning and for the many conversations we've had. Today is going to focus in on best practice for working with children and young people in a performance education setting. And it's quite a long sort of title, and in a way it's quite a varied area, and there are many different sides to it and many different ways of working. And that's why we really want to shine the light on that today and to look at that in some detail. I'm here really to welcome you and to just take you through the overview of the day, and then Eve will guide you in more detail around the content. So we're going to begin now and take you right through till 12:30. We have a number of case studies, and then we'll also have discussion and an opportunity for you from the floor to contribute as well. For those of you who haven't been here before, this is the Contemporary Music Centre Library, and this is where we house all of our music, and you can see on the walls there the scores and the collection. It's particularly relevant for us at the Contemporary Music Centre to be looking at ways in which composers can engage in performance music education settings. And we're very interested in this for a number of reasons. As well as documenting the works by Irish composers and promoting the works, we're very interested in developing the whole area. And we see this as being particularly important from the point of view of audience development and also continuous professional development for composers. And it's along these two areas that we're very pleased to be working with Music Generation and also with Music Network in relation to composers and performance music education settings. So for now, I would just like to hand over to Rosaleen Malloy, who I'm sure you all know very well, the National Director of Music Generation, to say a few words. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Karen. Good morning, everyone, and delighted to be here and delighted to see such a mix of composers, musicians, practitioners, managers, programmers, all of us that work in a variety of different roles across performance music education. Really what I want to say is this. Composition is increasingly becoming an absolute central and pivotal part of the spectrum of performance music education across the range of work and the breadth of work that the local music education partnerships are actually doing in Ireland at the moment. And it's really important for you all to know that the role of composers in performance music education is really quite central. And it's really quite unimaginable to even conceive or think of performance music education in the 21st century without composition being an integral part of it. And in a model of performance music education that is so much built on the values of diversity and inclusion and access, composition is the route map to upholding all of those values for children and young people's experience of performance music education, because the composition experience allows children and young people, irrespective of what stage they're at in their performance, of the most elementary stage of technical ability right up to technical proficiency and being able to master perform. When you're involved in composition, no matter what stage you're at in teaching and learning and performing, it gives you that opportunity to be able to be involved in something creative, to express yourself, and to get right involved in the heart of music making from the get-go. And it's for all of those reasons that that composition is so central to performance music education. So today, what I look forward to in this session is learning more about models of practice, to sharing all of the good practice and best practice that people have experienced, and to taking all of that away to be able to share it and put it back into the work that's happening in composition in performance music education through Music Generation programmes around the country. So on that note, I'll hand over to Eve, I think.
Yes.
So, now Jonathan, do I need to be sort of anywhere? Okay, I'll just stay here. So good morning, everyone, and welcome. And just to echo Carol and Rosaline, thanks for coming, and it's great to see such a mix. And for me, it's a particular pleasure to be back here and to be back in this room. To be honest, it's a bit of a time warp. Some of you may not know I used to be the director here, and although it's 5.5 years since I've, handed that role over to Yvonne Ferguson, who's now carrying it on so well, this building and this organisation will always be carved on my heart, I might as well admit, in a good way. Mostly in a good way. So, I'm not going to talk for too long, really, because I think the most useful thing we can all do is have the discussion and the questions and answers at the end. And before we get to that, then, we're going to have 2 case studies of different ways of working in a music education context with composers. So what I'd like to do is just frame some of those ways and also put out some of the thinking that CMC and ourselves have done so far in trying to tease out what is it that we need to do to help more of this work to happen and to happen in the best possible way, hence the best practice title. So I would just like to put out a few kind of thinking things first and explain a couple of things as well. And so there are 2 terms or phrases that will float around a lot, certainly from the music generation side of things, and one of them is performance music education. So what's that? This is the phrase that music generation uses to describe the broad way that it works with children and young people, because we don't work with the state curriculum. Music generation musicians don't deliver the primary or the secondary school music curriculum in schools. They go in to do high quality vocal and instrumental tuition. And Rosalind, stop me if I've got any of these finer policy points wrong. So performance music education is how we usually refer to that, and the performance bit of that is really important, because in the way that our musicians work, and there are a number of them in the room who work with different partnerships, in the way that they work, it's learning by doing, really, and performance always inevitably seems to be the natural outcome. It can be in the simplest way or in the most impressive way. It can be in the classroom for a few parents, no fuss. It can be in an arts centre with loads of fuss and excitement. So that's performance music education. And the other phrase then that you'll probably hear is MEP, or Music Education Partnership. And that's the name for the county music services, if you want to think of it like that, of which we have 11 in the country now, plus Donegal, as we have 11 areas in the country, plus Donegal, which was the original pilot project for all of this. And you probably know that Music Network, and my colleague Deirdre here is here from Music Network, is the parent company which sort of dreamt up the original vision way back. But that's something that you can look up on the Music Generation website. So the thinking pieces then, if both ourselves and CMC are looking at what's the best way of getting composers, in other words creative people, to work with children and young people within an education context, I think there are a few new ways of thinking about models for this. For instance, composers do fit into a structure very, very naturally with children and young people. Because, frankly, what happens to us, I think, as we get older, is we get the creativity kind of knocked out of us. But do you know any small child who isn't instinctively creative on absolutely every aspect of their lives? I mean, that's sort of the pool that we're born into as a baby or a small child, is to be creative about everything. But as we go up through our education, people tend to say to us, no, that's wrong, you have to do it like that. Now, composers generally, I think, again, have sort of rediscovered that play, creative bit of themselves again, and very often they're playing as adults with all sorts of new ideas, and people are saying, no, that's wrong, and the composer is saying, no, that's how I see it, that's my music. So when we bring those 2 together actively in a room, in a space, just magic happens. Now, that's grand, that's almost the easy bit, but how do we structure it so that it works just on a practical framework, on a production framework almost? So I would say that there are a couple of aspects to that. The children and young people, and I use that phrase because we think of sort of 0 to 18 really as the market almost for this kind of work. The children and young people will engage very naturally with the composer, but for a composer, it may not feel natural to be in that framework. Some people sort of have it in them naturally. Some people are really good creative people, but they're a little bit baffled when they suddenly have 20 or 30 excited young people wanting to make music with them. So I would suggest that what composers at the moment tend to think of, which is a commission, quote unquote, is possibly not the best model to think of in relation to working with children and young people. Now, there are work opportunities here for composers. There are music educators who want composers to work with them. So it's about how do we bring them together. Now, I'd like to put out for you to think about as the discussion goes on that there are 3 different models of composers working with children and young people. So one is what I'd call the formal commission. And, this is the one that everybody knows, really. Somebody rings you up or somebody writes to you and says, please will you write, a 20-minute piece for my chamber orchestra, and it'll be premiered in the National Concert Hall, and, I'd like, I don't know, strings, brass and wind, whatever. So it's quite a set thing, and the composer goes, fantastic, love to do that, thank you very much. Bit of talk about the fee. They go off and write it, and then they come back, a week or so before the performance. They rehearse it, they perform it. There's a paying audience. It's all very structured. I would like to suggest that this is probably not the best way to think when you're working with the under 18 cohort. So I think there are 2 other more useful ways to think. One is what I would call a sort of a middle ground, and this is where there's a commission plus a residency. Now, a sort of halfway house where the composer engages actively with the children and young people in a workshopping sort of framework. The composer is drawing out the creativity of the group. There might be a separate commission element where perhaps the composer is asked to write a kind of a wraparound framework, but essentially you have the creative part in the middle is written by the children and young people. You just might need something to kind of top and tail it. In that case, the commissioning bit belongs to the composer, but the bit that was developed in the workshop and the residency belongs to the children. It's their music. The composer helped them, but it's their music. In the straight up and down commission, obviously, it belongs to the composer. He or she went away, to their studio, wrote it, and came back and said, here's my piece. Now, so those are the end, the sort of the formal part, the middle combo way, as I think of it. Then there's what I'd call a creative composition residency, which is at the other end of the spectrum. And this is where the composer works with a group of children and young people to draw out their creativity in the room, on the spot. Nothing is done outside the room. It's a 2-way collaboration. And the outcome of that then, whatever it may be, belongs to the children. It's totally their music. It might be notated, it mightn't be notated. It might be in any genre, it might be a mix. You've totally used their creativity, but you as the composer, because of your abilities and your training, you're able to draw that out of them. So those, I would say, are 3 different ways of thinking, of which the combination commission and residency and the creative engagement are, to me, the most useful ones, and this is from experience in working quite closely with music generation projects of this kind over the last couple of years. So a couple of points follow on from this before we get to the case study, to sort of see some actual examples of how those 2 models worked in practice. I think it's important to note that you can work in either of those 2 ways across all the genres of music. And within music generation partnerships over the last year or 2, we've had everything from sort of jazz composition, improvisation, to rock and pop, to songwriting, to contemporary classical, to trad fused, to sort of trad as trad, but like it's composed trad. That's very interesting. Or trad as fused with something. Or, we've literally had everything. The point about it is that it's a creative engagement with people of all ages in one space, put people in a room and close the door. And all kinds of things can happen, good things. Now, I'd like now to bring us to the two case studies. So we have one which is the creative composition, everything happens in the room and the outcome belongs to the children. And Elaine Agnew, who's I'm sure known to everybody here, is going to speak about that. But first of all, I'd like to invite Rona McGrath, my colleague here from Music Generation Sligo, who really has been probably the earliest MEP into the whole composition framework and has worked in several different successive projects now across a period of time. And she's going to speak about that middle type where there's a residency element but there's also a commissioning element, and it really is groundbreaking work. And then when we've had those two case studies, we'll get into more of a discussion and kind of general Q&A. Okay, everybody okay so far? Grand. So I'm going to hand over to Rona McGrath, who's the coordinator of Music Generation Sligo.
Program. And it was decided quite early on when we were actually putting together our application to Music Generation for the overall programme funding, applying for the programme. It was decided that we would be able to access Present for Art funding and use that, because there has to be match funding in all of Music Generation's programmes, and that funding would be part of the match funding. So from the outset there was a call put out to 5 composers to once we had the Music Generation programme in place, and the outcome was that Brian Irvine was selected as the composer for us. And then to add the other piece that Eve was talking about, what the Public Arts Steering Group in the County Council wanted. They wanted young people involved, which of course absolutely fitted the Music Generation programme, and it's why it was part of our programme. But they wanted a mentoring process for young composers, so we were very excited about that and happy to tie it in. So this is just kind of, you all have the programmes there. That's our poster that showed the end product, but it was a long way to get to that product and that date. The date actually moved a few times, because I'll say further on that time is a big part of this. So as I say, it was a commission by the County Council and that comes through the Department of Environment, Community and Local Government Present for Art Fund, and of course Music Generation. We produced it, Music Generation Sligo produced it, but we worked with Sligo Academy of Music with Lochbow Films on the visuals, which you'll see. And it was part of Sligo International Choral Festival. It was on that weekend in November 2013. This is the full stage in the Hawkswell, absolutely full with young people. The orchestra at the front, we had 80 in the orchestra. We had some adult musicians as well performing with the youth orchestra. There was 120 in the choir, and then this is just one of the visuals that you'll see. So that's just to give you a sense of what it looked like on the stage. So just to pull it back a bit, they were the pieces that were performed. So as Eve spoke about the wrapping around part, what it was decided was that Brian, there were initially 6 young people selected, but one had to pull out due to exams because the time moved a bit on it and it was coming up to her junior cert, so she wasn't able to commit to it. So we ended up with 5 young composers. Brian, the way it turned out, Brian wrote the opening and the end piece, and then each of the young composers wrote a piece. So there was 7 movements, if you like. Brian was appointed in October 2012, and the young composers would have come on board in about November 2012, but didn't really get working on it properly until January 2013. And that was actually when I started working myself in Music Generation. There was a previous coordinator to me. So originally the date was set for April 2013, but it became very obvious that wasn't going to happen because there's a lot of work involved in mentoring young people to bring them to the stage where they were ready to actually write the piece and there was so many aspects to it. They were writing for a youth orchestra as well. I suppose that's another aspect which I come to, like it's all young people writing and performing, and that kind of brought its own challenges, exciting but challenging as they were. And from the very outset, Brian wanted visuals. That wasn't something that we had anticipated, but it was actually really important part of it. It kind of brought the whole a whole sense of a show to it, where it wasn't taken away from the music at all. It actually complemented it really well, and it brought even more young people into the mix because we had a team of young artists along with some adult artists developing those visuals. So that's just, they're all listed in the programme anyhow, the names of our young composers and the pieces they wrote. And they decided on space as the theme. That was just a general consensus among them all, with Brian from early on that space would be the theme, and it gave lots of scope. So, 5 young composers, what does that involve? Well, we had to get them MacBooks. We bought 5 Macs by Sibelius. We needed to find a suitable working space for them to meet Brian. They would have met him after school. It was every few weekends that they met. It was probably every 6 weeks that they met Brian, kind of from January on. And we found to find a suitable working space and time that wasn't impacting on their school day too much. So it would have been after school, and then as we get closer to the having to have it ready for to be learned by the orchestra and the choir. So kind of May, we started to have to pull in full days and say, could you get time out of school because we really need to get this. So it was kind of. They were finishing it up by May, June, but really over the summer I think Brian would have gotten the work from the young composers and had to do a bit of work on it obviously himself to make it ready to be scored, and really it was September before we had it out to the choirs, to the directors. So communication, appropriate communication, like with the young people, let's say in between permissions for them to communicate with Brian in between the workshops and that sort of thing, and time. The choir, we had 2 secondary, we brought together, we discussed how we would do a choir. It was going to be 2 owners and read them together, but keeping the choir wanted to have where the choir director already had contact with the young people. So there was 2 second choirs and a choir. And actually 4 there was more members of the choirs spread out. And we did some advanced workshops with the choir directors in May. It was a little bit of a kind of a glimmer of what might be about the pieces. And again, it was just time. It was really down to the last minute when they got the pieces start working with them in September. They have to have them by September. They'll be back at school. The orchestra, as I said, it was the Sligo Academy of Music, the Sinfonietta Youth Orchestra. So again, they got the scores in September. One young composer would have been a member of the youth orchestra anyhow. And what was lovely to see, the contact with the young composers. The young composers came into the rehearsals with the youth orchestra, and you'll see it in the clip. They were able to kind of stand in front of their peers, which they were quite nervous about, but they were able to help explain what their piece of music was about and how they thought it might sound and what their kind of why they'd written it essentially. So it was lovely to see that happening. And again, time, it's never have enough time. So that's just a photograph of the choir. And the choir, they ranged in age from kind of 5th class up to mostly secondary school. But like you just see one girl there, she's standing like this because there wasn't enough time, I suppose, to perfect the performance. We had the performance on the 10th of November 2013. We had 2 shows because there were so many young people on the stage. Obviously, for all their families to go to it, it would have filled the Hawkswell in one show. So we had a second show that same day during the choral festival. And we performed it again then in 2014, thankfully, because they didn't want to let it go. And they still haven't. The pieces are still performed. We performed it in the Hawkswell for a school's audience during the daytime, and then in the concert hall as part of a Music Generation conference and gala event. So that was really special for the young people to be on the concert hall stage. That's the 5 young composers, Ferdia, Ciara, Niamh, Alice and Matthew, with Brian after the first performance, very happy with themselves. And I have some quotes. It was just, I actually emailed them all last week to catch up and see where they are now with their music and their composing. So I'll just give you a few minutes to have a look at them. Am I okay for time?
Yes,
Karen? Was what they were kind of getting across, even now, 3 years later, was the impact that it had in working with Brian. He was a fabulous person for working with young people, and gave so much of his own energy. I think he was just absolutely exhausted after the performances in November. But Elaine, I'm sure you know that, how much you give of yourself as a composer, but particularly in working with young people. He also conducted, as you could see from that photograph. But also the sense of pride they had when their music was performed. And also the nervousness, as I said, that they had in standing in front of young people their own age who were performing their music. And it just tied, it just worked out so well, the music, the pieces then that Brian had, to say, that topped and tailed in a, obviously extremely well the music that each of the young people performed. And there was a mix of soloists as well as full orchestra, full choir performing them. I can, if anybody wants to look at the quotes again. And then I asked them, are they still composing? So you can see there's a mixture of songwriting. And one of them, they're waiting to be recorded, his songs at the moment, you know, so they'll be very confident, some of the young people, after the process. In a band, this young lad, he didn't read music, or he wasn't a classical, but he's now in a band, and this is, even though it's not classical, he doesn't think he'd have that creativity in him that he has now. And then another young composer is constantly composing. In fact, she has the Mac again for a while, doing more composing, and she asked, have you heard of any opportunities that you compose for an orchestra? So like, ready and waiting. So I'll play the clip, which is, we made a film documentary. So Sinead Dolan, who did the visuals, also documented it from different interviews. And we didn't record the performance as a performance. We included some of the clips in the documentary. It's a longer documentary, but we made a short, we edited it down for the Arts and Education website. I don't know if you're familiar with that portal that the Department of Education launched, artsandeducation.ie. So this case study is on that website. So I'll just click here and let you. So they say this is an edit of about 6 minutes from the longer document. Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah.
I've been part of this music generation course in Sligo, where we've been doing composing courses with composer Brian Irvine.
It's been an enormous project, you know, because we started off with, well, say 5 young composers. Actually, none of them had really written the piece before.
Well, I remember the first time we walked in, Brian just got us to think of all these different themes, and then we did all these different rhythms, and it was just, so from that I was thinking, how are we going to compose a piece from that?
And we decided collectively that we would write a sort of multi-movement work about and inspired by space. What we asked them to do was write a piece for orchestra and choir, which was an enormous kind of task. So what we now have is 150, 200 young people or something like that in a room singing the music that they made.
Before the programme, I expected it to be in a centre with a really strict person telling us all the ins and outs of classical composing, and when Brian appeared it was completely different.
I remember the day we got the Mac computers that we were all given for the piece, and very first day we were messing around with the music software Sibelius 7, and it was just noise we were coming out with, and that was the story for a good few weeks.
First, when we got Sibelius, we didn't know how to use it at all. I was like
struggling with it, going, oh, how do you do this? And then I'd delete something and I wouldn't save it. But now, when he taught us, if I had to go back and do it again, I know how to use it now.
It's like everyone else in this program actually knows notation, but I don't have any experience in notation. But it was easy enough because the music program we use is Sibelius, and it's quite easy to pick up.
I think what they've all made is really astonishing and very reflective of their characters. They've managed to kind of tap into something which is about them.
I wasn't able to put my Irish instruments on Sibelius,
Yeah.
but I just put them on other instruments.
I felt just as the little girls trying to compose a piece for an orchestra. I didn't really see it much as a proper orchestra and me being a composer, but now after it all, it's just been amazing.
The pages that the orchestra are reading off, and it has your name on it, like where the composer is, so it's just a great feeling.
When you listen to the final pieces, the ones we've come up with after 8, maybe 9 months of working on the pieces, we've come a long way. We've all developed and discovered our musical styles.
I was worried that I wouldn't get the score done in time, or that the choir wouldn't have enough time to learn it, and whether anyone would like it. I just think that I'm so lucky that I have this worry, because so many people can't even dream of having this opportunity. So it was just brilliant to put things in perspective that we were getting this chance.
That's Ciara Murphy herself, the composer. She sang it herself. Yeah.
It's huge opportunity, but a huge pressure as well, because when we were giving out the music, the scores for my piece, and I was on the edge of my seat because looking at everyone, seeing what the reactions were to it. I think you need to have those kind of nerves, because if you're not nervous, then you won't really care about it as much.
So we'll have to actually run through the full show to hear the music and with the visuals. It's absolutely great.
Alice is one of the composers, and she's there taking the rehearsal, but she's in the front saying, right, this is the way it's supposed to go, and telling you. And that's also like an enormous part of composition, developing those skills to communicate with people, you know. There are difficulties about doing projects like this in somewhere like Sligo, because what you have is a group of very individually motivated teachers and students. So you don't have that embedded musical instrument learning in schools. People learn instruments outside of schools, places like the academy, which are not part of an institutionalised structure. I mean, I think that's principally the objective of music generation, to establish or create an infrastructure that will be here forever.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. So we will have an opportunity later to have contributions from the floor or ask any questions. So we'll move on now. Oh yes, yeah.
Great. Terrific, Rona. Thanks very much. That just was an amazing project, and it wasn't just from the composition side of things, but I remember being at the rehearsals before the first performance, and even for the young people in the youth orchestras and the choirs, it was very new for them all to be performing in a big group, and you could really sort of see them trying to get their heads around this whole thing of being so many people together in one room, also working on music that was unfamiliar to them. But by golly, by the time they had the first performance over them and they were on to the following ones, they were just steaming ahead. And I'm sure you'd find with anything you do with them now, like they come straight in and they know what it's all about and they get on with it. So that's all a bit of this whole process as well. That's all why it's so useful. So I think what I just want to say that you saw, for me, what I saw in that was what we think of in music generation as the possible self. This is young people looking at Brian and going, I could do that. You know, I like this process of developing my own music. Actually, I could do that one day. And that's so important. Composers are such good role models for that. And also, you know, it really makes the point that, you know, number one, composers are alive. They're not dead. They don't have long curly wigs. They're not all men. You know, all of that. It doesn't have to be stuff that was written like how many 100 years ago? And that's really important. So thank you, Rona, for all of that, and congratulations on the work. So now Elaine Agnew is going to introduce us to the third model, where nothing comes in to the room at all. It all happens in the engagement, and she'll introduce the project and explain to you what it was all about, and that happened under the Music Generation Arts Council partnership. And if anyone's wondering, like, what are the processes about this? Those are some of the things we'll look at in the discussion after, so we just want to stick with the music for this part. Thanks.
Hi, good morning everyone. I feel I need to get you up on your feet doing some kind of a workshop warm-up, but we're going to do that at the end. I have about like a 10-minute slot, so everybody should have a music sheet, and I'm delighted to see Robbie here and lots of strong singers. So I'm going to talk about a case study that I was involved in last year. And I'd just like to end my little bit this morning having a sing through this really beautiful song that was created by a group of children. So I'm going to talk about the composer as a resource in the classroom, where it's all about the kids and it's not about the composer whatsoever. The composer isn't paid a commission fee or anything. You're there purely as a facilitator. And this project that I'm going to base just my little bit about was a project with Music Generation Louth. It's funded under the Music Generation Arts Council partnership last year, where I worked with two other musicians, and we really explored the music around Carlingford, that area of County Louth. And in that particular project, I was very much a channel, where I was in a classroom working with a group of children who were 3rd to 6th class in this particular project. And my role was to get them to be creative. And for me, my role was to encourage their creativity and for them to create a piece. So all the material, everything, the ideas came from them. And sometimes I would go home and do a wee bit of work at night time and then come back in the next visit and go, hey, maybe we do this or we change this about, let's try it. So it's maybe 99% all from the children, and then you're just kind of, I suppose, crafting it and making sense of it. So that line that Eve said, it all happens in the room, is really what this particular concept is about. So like what we saw there, Brian and his involvement, you're very much a teacher. You could end up being the conductor. You might also be the accompanist. You also might have to do some creative writing facilitating. So you're there with a number of different hats on. And I suppose it's you being comfortable in that space is probably the most important thing of this particular way of working. It's something that you really, really have to love doing, or else it could be, for some people, it could be their idea of hell, being in a class with 30 kids with instruments and the noise and how everybody could just, it's I suppose it's all about how comfortable you are in those situations. And I think for me, it's something I've always really been interested in, is taking creativity into a classroom and encouraging them to be creative. Because I'm a great believer, if you've got a heartbeat, you can make music and you can play music. But I think the person who does that, who facilitates that, the composer, still needs to have incredible compositional skills. So I still think that you, as a facilitator, as a composition facilitator, have to be really, really skilled and really well, have a very high level of achievement in your own creative work, and to be very confident in what you do. And then when you go into the classroom, you can really relate to whoever your audience is. So in this particular case study, we decided that with the group of children I worked with, we were going to write a song, and that came from, I suppose, the theme of the project, where we were re-exploring the music of the Kingdom of Oriel all around the north part of County Louth. And it was really the children who came up with the idea of wanting to sing. And I said, well, if we're going to sing, we need words. So the children themselves came in to a number of different sessions, and they just went home and they came up with the idea of writing about what it is that they love about where they live. And so that became the title of the song. So they came in with little lines, and I was working with Zoe Conway in the project, and so she had time to type out all of their words and to create a little verse. And then with the children then I got them to set it to music, and I'll explain exactly how we did it. So the music belongs to them and not to you, so it's slightly different to, I suppose, elements of what Rona was saying, where part of the project with Brian, he was the composer, and then alongside that then was the work of the younger composers. I think one of the most important things as well in this type of work is the preparation leading up to it. You can never ever be well enough prepared. So if you're going to be involved in working with a class or whatever your audience group's going to be, that you meet the teacher beforehand, or even go in and meet the children beforehand, get a sense of what the space looks like. So that would all be part, I suppose, of training or logisticals associated with it. But I do have to say that you have to really, really love this type of work, and that you're comfortable. Quite often a teacher will get involved. I like to have a big circle of chairs, so you get rid of tables, and when you're sitting in circle chairs, you're the facilitator, but there's a sense of evenness among everyone, and quite often the teacher may stay behind their chair. So I would always put out an extra chair and make sure the teacher comes and joins us. And I think children love that when the teacher gets involved and becomes one of them. So there are things, I suppose, that I've learned along the way, and to be really, I suppose, to make sure that you have enough time to achieve what it is that you're being asked to do, so that whatever or whoever is setting the project up, that you know exactly what's going on in your own head, and that you know that you will be able to create with the children this end result within a given time frame. If you think the time frame is too long or too short, you need to speak up and say that. So, but it's one of those things, you don't really know your audience until you're actually in working with them. So the whole idea of preparation and knowing exactly the resources that you have in the classroom. Do you need a piano? Do you need to bring a keyboard with you? Do they have any percussion? Are you going to play percussion? Do you want to do chinned, unchinned? So they're all the things that you really need to focus on. And I think the reason why children really love it, and children really do love it, and teachers seem to really love it, and they seem to think that composers bring some kind of a sense of magic. Like, they'll always say, how do you get the kids to do that? And even when we do concerts and parents come in and they'll say to me, how do you get my child just to stand there really still and sing? Whereas, at home they're all over the place. So I think it's when you're doing an activity that they have complete ownership of and that they're completely engaged with. And it's that sense that you're really bringing music alive. So it's their words, it's their song, it's their tune. They're standing up there, they're presenting what they have created. And they get the same buzz from it that I get, and I'm sure all the composers in the room, that they get as well. And I think the really great thing for me is that I learn as much from them as I hope that they're learning from me. So it's definitely very much a two-way thing. And it's that whole idea of you're learning by doing, the whole practical aspect of it. And as what Eve was saying there, that those young composers involved with Brian, you know, are thinking, you know, I can do this. This is easy. That's the whole thing. It's about making it easy. So you're not going in there with a certain set of skills and you're trying to put your ideas on top of them. Your skill is being able to communicate with them and to be able to get the best and sometimes the worst out of them. And then with whatever it is that they create, that you know, however crazy it is, however loud, however quiet, however minimal, however busy it is, that you will be able to somehow with them craft it into something that has a beginning and a middle and an end, that has a climax at some point, that has maybe some contrast in dynamics. So you're thinking of all the musical stuff, the ingredients that makes it, I suppose, fulfilling as a listener. So you have to be aware of the actual listening audience, what they're going to get out of it. And I think the most important thing is that there's no right or there's no wrong. And I think that's what children love, because I think, you know, when they do, well, I'm just saying, when I used to have piano lessons and you play a wrong note, and the amount of times I was, well, that's wrong. Whereas with composition and creative work, there is no right or wrong, that you can make the most beautiful things out of the most weirdest material. And you can create moments that are intensely beautiful and then moments that are just completely manic. But it's the enthusiasm that you bring into that situation and the fact that it's really obvious that you love being there. I think they're the two main things I think that you can bring to it. And it's not focused on grades. And I really like it when children actually don't play any music instruments. So in this particular case, if everybody just grab their little score. We're in a school in Rathcore, so it's just outside Carlingford. And there were about maybe 30 children in the class, and it was a split school. I had all the 3rd to 6th class. And I ended up just working with 11 children because they were the 11 children in the room who didn't play anything. So in a lot of projects, I always end up with the kids that don't play any instruments. And in this particular project, because I was working with 2 traditional musicians, all the fiddle players, tin whistles and guitarists had gone, and they were working with Barry and with Zoe, and they were doing their own little work and practicing music that they had composed for traditional instruments. And then I was left with 11 little kids all sitting in the front row going, but I don't play anything, and I don't sing, and I don't do this. So we had decided in an earlier session that these 11 little kids would write a song then that every child in the project would sing, and there were 4 schools altogether. It was maybe up to 70 children. So all the children in the 4 schools created words. So I've just put a selection of the words there at the bottom. I like where I live in Rathcore. There's the Cooley Mountains and Templetown Shore. So really, really beautiful words. And the children, as we were singing it, were able to, oh, that's my line, and that's my line, I did that bit, and isn't that a great bit? So they had real sense of ownership of the piece. And so what I did was, I have a box of chime bars. I love chime bars. My car is full of boxes of chime bars. And they're, you get a box, and there's 2 octaves from G up to G, all the white and the 9 black in between. And they're all handheld. So if you've got 25 children in a class, you can get them sitting in a big circle. Everybody randomly come and grab a chime bar and a beater. And, okay, we'll start here. And can we go around the circle and everybody plays one by one? Ding, ding. So it's the 25 notes will be 1 note each time within that range of 2 octaves. And I like it when they randomly pick. So boys always go for the big low ones. That's just... Girls always go for the wee tiny ones, so they always have the twinkle twinkle little star or the tiny little chime bars at the top. So in this case, because we were going to create a song, I had to put some kind of sense of like a key or chosen notes. And so I picked out 50 notes from the chime bar box, and I just put them on the floor and said to the 11, come and grab a chime bar each, and make sure in the order that you sit that it's not all boys together and all girls together. So they sit in a sequence. So if you look at the well, it's bar 39. So it went girl, girl, boy, girl, boy, girl, 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 boy, girl, boy, because we only had 4 boys and 7 girls. And we started with the first girl, Anya. So she was sitting at this side, and I said, just play it in the row. So we went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And we came up with that sequence. And then the children suggested, well, we could play it backwards. So we played it from 11 back to 1. Then they suggested, well, could we start at this end and this end? And they both play at the same time, coming this way, cross over and go that way. And then we've got harmony, which was great. So they did that. So we thought of different combinations. Could we go 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4, 1, 5, 1, 6? So the children then started thinking about it mathematically and came up with all these great combinations. Only play if your birthday's in March. Only play if your birthday's in April. It all got very complicated at some point. But for this particular song, I asked all the girls to play at the same time. So when they played at the same time, the 7 of them, we got that chord. And then when all the boys played, they came up with that chord. So I asked the girls, just let's keep playing. Girls, 2, 3, boys, 2, 3, girls, 2, 3, boys. And then this little girl that was sitting, she had a chime bar. She was part of the chime bar group. She started going, da-dum, da-da-dum. She started humming little bits of tune. And then another kid picked up and went, I like where I live. Oh. So the idea was that we had these chords, and then they started making up the tune. And that was how this little piece was born. And then I took it home and just tweaked a few things and maybe changed a few of the lines around because the number of syllables suited the line a little bit better. And then I came back in the next week with a keyboard and we sang through it, and they were so chuffed. And then when we taught it to the 4 other schools, everybody loved it. But I went home thinking, oh, you could do this and then you could do that and you could, it'll work as a round and that's really beautiful. And then thought, no, it's theirs. It has to be exactly as they had composed it. And I think when we did the performance, we did a couple of performances last year. This was probably maybe one of the most beautiful moments in it, where everything is very still and the kids sing with these beautiful voices. And the melody is very simple and the words are theirs, the melody is theirs. And so they sing and perform it in a completely different way if it was something that I had composed that I was asking them to perform. So will we have a wee sing through? How's your sight reading? This is the test. Be very still. And would you all like to stand? Because you should never sit and sing. Back your toes. So the chime bar melody, the 11 notes goes like this. I suppose that's how we ended up being in 3/3, because there's a kind of a waltz sense. 1, 2, 3. And we decided just to put in a little rest at the end to make it 4 bars of 3/4 time. And then when the girls all play together, you get this chord. 2, 3, 2, 3, 2, 3. So that was how it comes. So it's basically 2 chords. It's like C major with another F sharp and G. 2, 1, 2, 3. I like where I live. I live in Rathcore. There's the Cooley Mountains and Templeton shore. Of the Cooley Mountains, looking at the loch, looking round and waiting for all the ships to dock. Over to the mountains, standing tall and high, in the lovely forests where nobody can sigh. Down to Rathcore Beach we go, on a boat and row, life jackets and oars in hand. What a make-believe land, what a So all of that came from the children, and as the composer, I just copied it down because we had a guitarist playing with us, just I suppose for necessity, in that he was just able to read the music and follow it, and the children just memorised it like that, really, really quickly. So that's how that came about. It's a really, really sweet song. Like, yeah, but it's not childish, or there's something really quite magical about it. So my role in this was as a channel to encourage the class to be creative, and that's an example of how we did it. And I did it with a set of chime bars, and worked with 11 children in this case who didn't play any music and who maybe slightly felt a bit left out, in that all the other musicians, the children that did play instruments, were away off rehearsing and doing other things. But they were so buzzed by this that they just thought they were so much better than everybody else. Yeah, so it's really important to make every child that you work with, because the ability within the classroom is huge, to make every child in that classroom feel incredibly special. Because quite often, if you don't play an instrument, you go and write some words, or you do this. But I say it's the kids that don't play music are maybe even slightly more creative than others, because they really don't know the right or the wrong. They're not aware of that at all. So I love this way of working, and if it's something that composers would really be interested in, it's something I think that there's a lot of opportunities out there. So please take your words home and teach it to everybody at home. If you've got children, teach it to all your children and keep singing it. Thank you. That's sweet.
That's fantastic to hear those two case studies. So we're going to actually bring everyone back up here. That's why we have the chairs, and have an opportunity to hear a little bit more, and also enable you to ask a question or make a comment. I'm conscious of time because I know some people have to go get buses at 12:30, so we're fine for time, but we will aim to finish up at 12:30. One speaker we haven't heard from, but who might say a few words as well about their experience, is Deirdre Moynihan, who's great to have with us here from Music Network. Deirdre is the programmes manager in Music Network, who were the initiators behind the sort of music generation infrastructure and project. And we'll all gather up here, but maybe Deirdre might begin and open up this session talking a little bit about Music Network's experience at the moment with commissioning and the quite varied range of projects that you're working with. So I'll just welcome Deirdre and welcome Eve and Elaine back over here, and I'll sort of go over here and maybe that should isn't there. The flavour of Music Networks, because then it'll give people an opportunity to refer to everybody if they have any questions at all.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Karen. Well, Music Network, I think we commission regularly, and we've commissioned in all of the three ways you've actually spoken about, Eve. There's the formal commissioning process that Eve spoke about, which we would do a number of commissions in that way every year, and the works would be premiered as part of our tours. We've also worked in using the models, the commission residency, which you spoke about. One recent project, which I could just briefly mention to you, is a project called A Most Peculiar Wintry Thing, which we commissioned this show specifically aimed at children between the age of 4 and 10 in partnership with the ARC. And it was a wonderful project to be part of. The commission had a foot, if you like, in a number of the methods that Eve was referring to. The project, it took place it was nearly 2 years from start to finish, but we commissioned Brian Irvine to work on this new commission, and it began with him working with very young children, aged 6 and 7, and they had workshops in the Ark where the children came in, and he encouraged them to put forward ideas in relation to snow and winter, and so they drew pictures and they got involved. There was an ensemble there for them to work with on the day, and they ended up conducting the ensemble, suggesting that people speak in different languages, and all these crazy ideas that eventually fed into the work in some way that Brian would eventually have commissioned for the show, or have written for the show. So it was a way of getting the children involved right from the start. In addition to that, the show would tour right around the country, and Brian also went to each location and workshopped with the children beforehand, where he, the type of commission you referred to, where he went into the room with the children, no pre-prepared material, and he just drew creatively from them, and they had something at the end of that was entirely there. And I think we can see from the beautiful song that Elaine showed us there what amazing work can come out of that and how the children can be inspired. So I suppose we have seen firsthand the value in commissioning across, using a variety of processes. And for us, it's important that the end work has, such artistic merit. It's of the highest quality, and it's important to say that whether something is commissioned in the formal way or whether it's a child-centred approach, we have found that the artistic merit is absolutely as high across each commissioning process. Some wonderful works have come out of each process, and that's something that we feel is important to stand over and to communicate to everybody, that the expectation is that the quality of the work is extremely high, and we've certainly found that to be in practice. I suppose you probably want to open up to the floor, but just to say that we absolutely recommend and identify with all of these processes, and we're happy to participate in commissioning in these ways.
Which is great, and as you've seen, there are many different ways, and what we would like to do with today is develop perhaps guidelines or something that we can maybe put down on paper, which will enable people to look at, I suppose, guidelines for working in these different settings. So just so everybody is aware that is the objective of this morning, that we will, after this morning, work on putting together information that we can circulate to you, both with links to resources and with, I suppose, do's and don'ts, for want of a better way of describing it, and to sort of feed into that, into that thought process that will continue after today. Would anybody who's just been here now, maybe already working in this way? There are composers here who work very frequently in this way. Vincent Kennedy is here, Peter Moore, and I know you do a lot of work already. There are other people, Robbie Blake there is already working. So there's lots of you here who are very experienced in this area, and others, new faces to me too. So would anybody like to make a comment or contribute at this point before I move on and bring in the panel? Any thoughts, comments?
It might be tricky to come up with all that off the top of your head. You mightn't realise how much you do by instinct after a while.
Yes, because you would work very instinctively in schools.
And having developed practice over the years, kind of think, what did I not do when I started, or what did I think about?
Yeah, I mean, the Contemporary Music Centre has worked with Peter here. Some of you may know, but we do have resources on our website that have come out of projects which Peter has worked on in schools in Dublin. And if you did want to have a look into those resources that you may yourself want to use in schools now, they're freely available. They're titled New Music Live, and there's 2 workbooks. The first set of worksheets in the first workbook, you can print off as PDFs, and they take you through different lesson plans that you can use in schools. And the second workbook introduced an electroacoustic aspect, so it's very much online as well, so you would need so back in the classroom, which you can work through worksheets there as well, and the children are composing electronically in that. And they're very successful worksheets. Peter worked on and went to many schools on, and do exist as a resource now, for people.
Would you like to say a bit about?
Yeah. I don't want to take over too much time. I'm conscious of that. So But it might be interesting for people to hear of some of the work that the Contemporary Music Centre has done in partnership with Music Generation and in the area. In particular, we worked with Music Generation Wicklow over a period of about 18 months on a project entitled New Notes Now, and it involved 4 commissions, and it involved 2 composers who are here, delighted to see them, Elaine Agnew of course and Vincent Kennedy, and 2 other composers, Neil Martin and George Higgs. And each composer worked in different parts of Wicklow. It came through Percent for Art funding, so in some ways followed a little bit the model that Rona was discussing, in that it was Percent for Art funding through the Arts Office, but connected into the fact that Music Generation Wicklow is in existence and has a very active programme, and was a partnership there. So we worked with Music Generation Wicklow. The Contemporary Music Centre produced and managed the commissions, and there were a variety of different settings, mostly working with school groups and or music groups that already existed in the county. I have quite a detailed breakdown of it, but I don't want to go into that in too much detail. It might be more interesting for me to communicate some of the learning I got out of it. I found my experience would be that what Rona was saying, the time, you just need time with these projects, and flexibility. Each one of these commissions resulted in a public performance outcome, and you need flexibility to even change dates, to change venues, so you have to be very open. Each one of these projects also involved and was very similar to the model that Eve described, the sort of the middle model, where it's kind of the composing in residency. So the composer would have gone into schools and workshopped with the young people, but would also have done some writing outside of the schools, and then would have really brought the children along with learning the piece of music, some of which they contributed to. In Elaine's case, some of the children wrote words for the songs, and then ultimately a piece of music was created. And in each one of these 4 commissions, professional musicians were involved, and that was kind of a very key identifiable factor that each one individually decided upon. It wasn't stipulated from the outset to the composer, you have to involve professional musicians. But I think the very nature that professional musicians exist through the Music Generation infrastructure, the tutors are invariably professional musicians. So they're on hand and were a real asset. Some of those were tutoring the children already in the classroom, and it meant that they were there to rehearse the music with the children on a weekly basis. So that, and because of resources, it wasn't possible to have the composer in the classroom each week. However, the tutor was going to that school, so could work on this material. And each one was, as I said, resulted in a public performance, so there was an opportunity for parents and everybody to come. I mean, my overall experience on the project was fantastic. I mean, it was a lot of work, and it's very detailed work, and the way of working is quite different. There's a lot of communicating with schools, which wouldn't be regular work for me, and dealing with children also, I think, does require an extra layer of work just because they're children. So, that has to be expected. They can't make their own way. You can't expect parents to do X, Y, and Z. It has to be done in a certain way. So there's a lot of layers that make it very resource heavy in terms of time, and also maybe financially from the point of view of making sure you're looking after and caring for everybody in the right way. And my one thing to say, which I'm saying very openly, is I would feel that from the outset, and I think it's been referred to, if a lot of thinking is put into the design of the project, while at the same time being open to be flexible, I think it's the most efficient in the long term and successful way of working. And I suppose that comes from the creators of the project. So be that coming from the Arts Office or from the Music Generation Infrastructure or the VEC. But if they are sort of clear in their thinking about what they want, then I think it makes it easier to be bringing in a composer or a facilitator in that way. My experience was there was a certain degree of time spent needlessly looking at the makeup of the project. So it's a little bit cart before the horse, you know. I think that unless you have a very good knowledge of what you have on the ground, be it that you have already a strong foundation program or an ensemble in your community or a choir in your community, and if you know that well, I think it's easier than bringing somebody in and expecting a project to happen. So I think the design of the project is very important. That's my main learning from it. And when that's not clear, it just makes it harder. It's not impossible, but it's harder because you have somebody in there working as a composer, as a facilitator, and it might not be very clear what they're meant to do. And having said that, I think if you are bringing in a composer or a facilitator, I suppose then there's also the other side of that is maybe being flexible, that they might suggest something which you hadn't seen because they're seeing it with different eyes. That maybe you do have a small ensemble in your county you weren't thinking of including, and they find out about it and kind of say, oh, but wouldn't it be great if we could have that bit of percussion? And maybe just to be flexible. But I think from the outset, when you are bringing somebody in, if there is a lot of thinking put into it, then it can run more smoothly. And yes, I would echo what Rona was saying about the time, and I'd also echo what Elaine is saying about the creativity. And I suppose I'm not saying that anybody does, but never to underestimate the children's creativity, as Elaine is saying, even with those who aren't already playing an instrument. It actually has got nothing to do with that, you know. Yeah. So. Yes.
A quick question on, I suppose, the priorities with the models and whether that comes into it in terms of seeing sort of the value of the outcomes. You know, if sort of model 1, to take that as the formal commission, model 2 to be the sort of in residence, and model 3 to be the drawing out the creativity of the children. Is it just a series of, you know, this project is a priority for, you know, developing, say, leadership skills in the young people and developing their creative skills, so therefore we'll go for model 3? Or is there a sense of, you know, for the example of the model that you were just, or the program that you were just talking about, how there are kind of different ways it was up to each composer to develop their own range? And I suppose I'm just kind of putting it out there, you know, are they equally valued in the sense of, if you go for the model 1, composer writes their piece and then it's up to the practitioners to develop the performance capacity of the young people, and that's just as valuable to them to have a chance to actually give a world premiere, for example. But what about, you know, I'm just putting it out there, it's like, is there a priority list for those things, and do you see a kind of because I think that might feed into a sort of work guide, you know, if you're kind of opening up to us to feed into maybe a guideline. It's sort of that fits into how a composer or creative person might come to the project. You know, what are the priorities of the outcomes?
And when you say priority, do you mean if it was like a funding application, if you're submitting a suggestion for a project, like which way to frame your own project? When you say priority for who?
Well, I suppose for the bodies who are putting the structure out there, and then also the priorities for what the children would get out of it.
Oh, okay, where the emphasis. I mean, is there anything in that, Eve, that you can pick up on from your experience? Like, would you, in the Arts Council partnership projects, what are the priorities coming through because of what's happening on the ground, or is there a sense from the outset we want to be encouraging, as you were suggesting, you know, the confidence or Rosaline, would you like to make a point?
Well, maybe if I put out a couple of bits around that first. I mean, it's a good question. Well, first of all, Karen referred there to the Music Generation Arts Council partnership, and this was a fund that the Arts Council gave to Music Generation across all the music education partnerships to use for projects that brought not only composers but also, you know, professional musicians who might not normally be working with children and young people on a weekly basis, to get them to engage with children and young people in that sort of education context. That was a 3-year funding block, and you know, I'll say straight away, it's all allocated now. I'm sorry, but we do hope that it's something that will come around again in a future funding application. But we used that then in Music Generation to devise a number of different kind of residency-type projects, and usually the idea came from the Music Education Partnership. You know, they had a certain group or they had a certain program, and they were just thinking, it'd be really interesting to bring somebody in. So the last couple of years, because I manage that partnership on behalf of the Arts Council and Music Generation, the last couple of years have been a sort of a kind of a laboratory experiment in a way of seeing what works and what doesn't work. And I've always been saying from the beginning that it's all about the children, and the money is to be spent in the room. And that goes for whether it's a composition project or whether it's a project. You know, we've had things like, you know, performers coming and working with programs. I mean, to me, the only answer that I can give to your question is that I think it's right, whatever it is, when the children and young people are engaging very actively in whatever it is. And I think that's actually the starting point, whether for people who want to bring in a composer or a musician, or whether it's the composer or the musician. I think everybody needs to be thinking, what's the experience that we want the child or young person to have? What do we want them to feel differently about afterwards? What's the experience that they can get? I mean, for me, one of the really striking things in Rona's presentation is there's a little quote from one of those young composers saying, "For me it was utter and total happiness," or something. Now, I mean, honestly, can you buy that? Like, a moment like that in any of our lives is gold dust. So if we can provide that, I always say a project is working well if I can walk into the room and nobody even looks up, if I could like throw a hand grenade in and nobody would even notice. I don't care what they're doing, whatever they're doing, it's the right thing then, in the moment, if that can happen, you know. But please, other people. Rosalind, did you want to?
I thought your question was interesting, Robbie, because as you were talking through it, and I thought, well, a lot of that is dependent on the commissioner. Because a lot of the briefs for these composition projects are set by the commissioner. But then, as I thought through it more, well, they don't have to be. They can change and they can be flexible. The only thing that I would say is that it was the point that I made earlier on, that music generation and the model of performance music education is very strongly built on values of access and inclusion and diversity. And that's why composition is so central in a model that is built on those values, because it opens the door to be able to introduce children immediately to music without having to wait until, for example, they're a certain standard or a certain grade to be able to read at a particular level. To, you know, that modality of way of thinking isn't necessarily relevant to it. So what I would suggest is that those three modes or models of ways of working are not in any hierarchical order, and that depending on what the individual composer's practice is and what the vision for the programme is by the commissioner, because I think the commissioner will have they will have a very strong influence on shaping and moulding and envisioning and setting the parameters of the brief, and then all of those factors actually determine what modality is actually used. But I think there isn't any one better way to do it than the other, except that I suppose the second and the third provide more of the children as a starting point in the process, is what I would say.
And I think maybe just to add, to be aware that music generation isn't the only framework in which this kind of work can happen. You know, schools, arts offices, just broadly, you know, festivals, Present for Art funding that comes in various different ways, you know, just for any of you who are interested in getting into that kind of work, there are many different ways, and sometimes you actually have to be the one to approach a particular group and say, look, how about I do a such and such, because this type of work is not really all that familiar in this country as yet, although it's been hugely explored in other countries. But there hasn't really been the funding. There hasn't been an obvious funding stream for it here. But that doesn't mean to say that it can't be brought together, that a pot of funding can't be brought together for this, because you can have projects of all sorts of scales, big or small, and it's part of an opportunity for portfolio working for any creative musician or composer.
Can I just come in there as well?
Yeah, no, no, continue.
Oh, sorry.
No, you
yeah, it's more. I'm just thinking. Yeah, it definitely would be. The commissioner would set the brief, and if there's to be young people involved. But as you're saying, Eve, if you come approach them with an idea, I think once the young people are involved, what's really important is to have this support, a good support structure, working with you. Because while Music Generation Sligo managed the commission formally, we made sure that we had a good working group of the teachers, say the music teachers in particular, and then the Sligo Academy of Music there, Niamh Crowley, the director, but also the tutors, because they're encouraging their young people. They have the contact with the young people all the time. I know that some of the young composers that have applied to be the young music teachers, or whoever they're, I suppose, most identify with in their musical lives up to that encourage them to take part. So I think it's important to have that, and that's voluntary. And it was their voluntary time that you're calling on, and their own music interest and involvement in the community. So when you're involving young people, there's a huge community effort as well, and that's important to recognise. Yeah, for it to happen.
Vincent, do you have a point?
Yeah, Vincent Kennedy. I suppose I had the experience of working with Wicklow Music Education and CMC project there. And I've also been involved in other projects, and I've really nothing more to add on sort of the creativity side of things that has already been explained, and you can see the wonders of all the things that are happening there. Except to back up Elaine's point, that you have to be yourself really enthusiastic about this, and the time factor, and you have to go in with your eyes wide open to it. And actually, the creativity and the music part of it, to me, is the easy bit. It's all the other things that are the difficult bit, and if I just can talk about those for a moment, thank you. It's the whole dynamic of the situation you're working in. In my last work, say Wicklow, I was working 4 schools, and the context was different in each of them. In 2 of the schools, I would say the principals were openly enthusiastic, and that's if you have the principal on your side, it makes a huge difference. You can't assume that in the other cases, just because the principals aren't coming in, that they don't know what's going on. They know everything that's going on in their schools. But in our situation, a problem arose right at the very end where a principal decided certain things, and we had no control over that. So you've got to expect the unexpected in relation to that. The other thing that happened was it spanned 2 different years. So we went from 1 year into another year, which means that classes changed, teachers changed. There were a whole lot of changes, so that can happen. You've no control over that as well. But you have to know and get to know the environment. This is where the time comes into it. Particularly in schools, they're very, very tight-run things. Simple things like, never sit. And these might sound stupid, but actually, I found them very useful because you can create an atmosphere. When you go into a staff room for a cup of tea, wait till someone tells you where to sit. Because if you watch your fans, as I am, of the Big Bang Theory, there are spots. Teachers want to teacher. You just sit at a teacher's spot, and they're forced to sit beside somebody that they've already, there could be other dynamics going on there. So practical things like that. You have to ask about, if you're working with the children, do any of them have learning difficulties? It won't be obvious. And the teachers will already know this, but they may not know to say it. Don't bring sweets or anything like that, because there's a whole allergy issue. Right? And I have seen people come in and do that, and you just have to be very, very careful about that. In the classroom setting, and there is a difference between a classroom setting and an outside classroom. In the classroom setting, the teacher, it is their classroom, and they may become very involved, or they might just sit in the background, but they will still be involved, and they may interrupt at any moment if they think some child is not behaving properly. And if you're not expecting that, that can be quite a difficult situation. So again, the best thing is to try and talk to the teacher beforehand to find out what the classroom situation is. And you will have, if it's a whole class situation, you'll have a group of children who just don't want to be there, who are not as interested. And, you know, it can be difficult, you're trying to include everybody, but sometimes, you know, there are some children who won't be interested. But you won't necessarily get that from looking at their faces, because some of the children who are most interested may look the most bored, you know, so you can't really tell. So like, don't assume anything, you know, but you can get an awful lot from teaching, talking to the teacher beforehand or afterwards. And then there's the after school situation, which, so in my situation there were a bit in the school and a bit after school. And usually the after school are the children who have already chosen to be in a particular place. So, you know, you've kind of half that battle as won there in terms of enthusiasm. And all of the time they're creative, but I think it's you need to get a handle on the whole practicalities of it, the timing, and I would say never be late, because schools run on a very synchronized system. You know, if you've got a particular time to be there, you don't want to be late. And they can change. All things can change very, very quickly. And getting to know the school secretary, I would say, is really, really important. Because they're the one who know all the times. They're the ones who knows how to contact people and know the different people and know an awful lot of the issues that are on in the school. So, and make up your own mind on things. You know, don't assume just because somebody's telling you this, particularly in the tutor situation. In my case, a couple of the tutors changed, and that created a different problem as well. You know? So, just expect the unexpected. Creativity and all of that part is the wonderful part of it, but all the bit that goes around it can be quite difficult. And if you're not expecting it, or if you're not used to it, it can really, really set you back in terms of your own, and you may, you know, you become negative about those sort of things. And the last thing I'll say is that the point that Karen was making, it really, nobody when the project starts will have a totally clear idea of the outcome. And all the outcomes will be successful, because there'll always be a concert and people will come and they'll all be enthusiastic. And the parents won't know all of the hard work and all the pain that you've gone through, so they'll just be delighted to see everybody there. And it is wonderful to see what children can produce with people. But sometimes there can be a difficulty. I would say a difficulty arose because there was a difference in the vision that had been set out at the beginning and what then came in about 4 weeks to go in our particular project, you know. So you have to be careful about who is actually in control of the project and who is actually running it, you know, in terms of things. So it's really practicalities. The easy thing is the music part.
And just on that question, because I think that's a very good point, who is actually in control of the vision? In your experience, who is? Is it the commissioner? Is it, or does that change throughout the process?
I think when it's a one-to-one situation, it's just the commissioner. In our particular case, though, where we worked in it, the CMC were running the project on behalf of the commissioner, and that was difficult, I think, for them as well. You know, and we were all working fine until a particular issue arose. You know. And that came very late in the process. Now we managed it, you know, but it's not easy when you're sort of, then you find out you're dealing with two different people. You know, I want to deal with Karen, and Karen's great for dealing with me, but she's then dealing with a different issue, and then people are ringing me then separately, you know, that sort of thing. You know, so that can be different. So the one-to-one is the best situation, you know, where you're dealing directly. Or where people just say, yes, we're handing this over completely to somebody, and they're the only people who deal with it.
I mean, I think you know, that's an example where I was referring back to really thinking through and being quite clear from the outset what the project is, and at the same time being flexible within that. But I think there has to be a clear thinking from the point of view of, I suppose, the commissioner, because they're the ones dealing with financial elements and have certain expectations, so they need to think through exactly what they really want to get out of it, and at the same time being open to taking on board the expertise that they're buying in, you know, and then I think spending money understand setting up projects from where from the end when you're actually going in with facilitating for the composers or musicians, you know, carrying it out.
And my question around this was, that ownership thing. Suppose it's at those various different stages of, as a commissioner, you almost set a greenfield site, and then you hand it over to the composer, and then the process of that then creates the ownership with those that make and create the music. So that was really what my question was about. That thing of ownership is shared, but possibly rooted very much with those that are making and creating the music, which ultimately are the participants in the third model.
Absolutely.
And I think I think it's a really good process to go back to people after a while and ask them, because immediately afterwards everybody's enthusiastic. It's great when you go back, a year, 5 years, 10 years. Like, why did any of us get involved? It probably was something that inspired us. It certainly was for me anyway. You won't know. We won't know the outcomes of some of this for years to come.
Did you have a point, Peter?
I was going to make a couple of points about the practice. First of all, I was actually very lucky starting. The way I got into this work was I was actually asked to help in another capacity with some technical aspects of a project. This was back in York, I don't know, a long time ago. And so I was working with someone who worked with children all the time, and she was a teacher and a practitioner and a performer, but not a composer. And so as we worked on projects like getting children to sing songs and then arrange songs, and I helped her point out, well, if you get this child to do this on the piano, then the guitar can do that, and helped her with some compositional aspects of it. And so increasingly we started to work together, and we eventually started doing projects where she was with the secondary school and I was with the primary school, and we'd do a show together at the end. But this is about a point that Elaine made earlier about that for some composers running a class can be a very stressful and overwhelming experience, and by working with someone who really specialised with that on a number of projects, I learned so much from her and got more and more comfortable with it, and realised, I was enjoying it, and other schools started inviting me back to do more and more projects, and that's where I got the confidence to do that sort of thing, because it certainly, absolutely, I remember some of the projects that really overwhelmed me at the time, the first time, in fact, that I was left on my own. But by working with someone who was completely comfortable in that environment, so I could be the creative side of things and she could be the manage the classroom side of things, and increasingly we learned a lot from each other and started working separately. The second point I was going to make is just that part of one of the things I love about this work is that the workshop itself can be a creative experience, and I almost never go back to old workshop formats. So it's like composing a workshop. What new way can I approach composition today? And what new way can I engage with this group? And what new way can I use chime bars? I hadn't used them in that way before, and I loved. I'd never used all 25 at once. I usually say you've got a choice between the letters A to G, so I don't mention anything about key or pitch. I just say A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and you might start spelling your name. So and then using them in different structures and things. So I'm always. It can be you can take a creative approach to how you even run the session and explore new creative ideas in that way as well.
Great. And I think if I could just make a small point in there, I think it's rarely a good idea for the composer to be doing a kind of a solo effort in one of these projects. I think it needs a team or two others, but I think it's very hard unless it's a small group in a really comfortable format. It's very hard for one single creative person to go in and work with a group, because even in your case you were working with Zoe Conway, highly experienced trad player, and also teacher, and also Barry Hines, a kind of multi-instrumentalist music tutor in Louth, and I think it was a real help, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, because I think when I started doing this work for a good 10-15 years, it was only ever just me. And it's exhausting. Yeah, I'm sure you must find that you come out. If you're not exhausted by 2 hours, you're doing something wrong.
Well, no respect for teachers at the end of it.
We
do this 5 days a week.
Yeah, like all year, like for 50 years. Yeah. So when you can collaborate with other musicians, and I think that's what's really lovely about the music generation model, is that whether you're working with people like Zoe, other facilitators, or you're working with the music generation tutors. It's great.
So I think it's always worth trying to structure that in, and whether it's, we've been talking a lot about working in schools, quote unquote. It doesn't always have to be that. It might be, a youth club framework. It might be an after school project. It might be, any number of different things. It was you who said, you always invite the teacher into the circle, and I really like that because sometimes the teacher kind of feels, I might do it wrong, because as an adult, he or she has that thing of, it'll be wrong. So always, try to gently invite that person in, and so sometimes they won't and you can't make them, but if they do, the children are just absolutely tickled pink to see their teacher in the circle learning exactly what they're learning, and that's what we kind of tend to frame as the artist-teacher partnership, if you want to give it a fancy name, but that is just so productive, and it's transformative within the working life of, I'm sure, any of you music education partnership people here, and we have some of the coordinators who might want to speak to that. It's transformative, and tutors as well who work in different MEPs. Any of you like to chip in on it?
Just
Sam,
that.
yeah.
To
Sam,
confirm it.
introduce yourself, Sam, so they know.
Hello, I'm Sam. Sam Kavanagh. I'm a tutor with Music Generation.
Your many hats.
And a composer and other things as well.
Yeah.
And just to confirm that point, it's nice to acknowledge and give the teacher in the room an option, if you're going into a classroom, an option to participate. Whether or not they physically participate is not necessarily the point, but they know that they're part of the process and they're part of it. And I know that it's happened in one of my schools in Dublin. In the beginning, I kind of just didn't interact with them because I was getting on with my thing, but now there's a bit more of a back and forth about what project we're working on towards the end of the year, and they're kind of more excited about it. They're getting, so we're doing a project with a children's storybook. I won't get into details of, but you can ask me later. But they're more excited about it. They have questions about it every time I come back. Oh, what are you going to do about this one? Or what are we going to do? Or some of them were even working during the week. Not that I said to, but just they work with the children during the week about similar themes that we're covering with this story and with the music that we're covering, and then by the time I get back to them, they'll have practiced singing a bit more, and they'll have done other things around the singing, and it's kind of the children's equivalent of the way a choir might go to the pub after rehearsal. Like it's important that during the week, outside of the official rehearsal time, there's some kind of connection to what you're doing. It definitely enhances it when you actually get back into official rehearsal time. It's not just about what's on paper and correcting, but there's all the bonding and all the other stuff that's intangible is surprisingly necessary in spite of its intangibility. So it's just a confirmation that getting the people that actually know the children on board, they're kind of here. And also they can help with, if there is a child who's particularly distracted one day, it's not really the place of someone who's just there for half an hour to correct them pretty heavily, but maybe the teacher that knows them can make the call, they'll calm down in a second, or no, let's pull them out of the circle for 5 minutes, or they have a bit more authority and knowledge when it comes to discipline, which helps just the classroom environment run smoother and everything.
Could I ask a question about composers? If a commissioner is going, or not even a commissioner, I think we run composition summer camps as well in Sligo. So if you're going looking for a composer for either a commission or to come and work for a week or to work over as a residency, is there a section, I don't know if there's in CMC, where for musicians that work with, or composers that work with young people?
We haven't categorised them, or we don't have this sort of subsection of these are the composers, because in a way we have their biogs and you can explore a little bit about them individually, but we have, that's one thing that I was going to throw out as a question, but no, to answer the question, on our website we have all our composers listed alphabetically, so there's nothing that defines them as a composer who works in this setting or that setting or the other setting, and it's really their individual biog which they choose to write, which I suppose they're highlighting within that what they want, so some of them might bring out their educational work and some might not. But I mean, the other thing to mention in relation to our website is we will have a completely new revamped website coming on stream in February. So look out for that, and we'll be in touch with you on that. But it does bring in that whole question of, you know, composers, and Elaine has mentioned, and as has Vincent, the energy that you need as a composer and the love that you need as a composer to work in this way. So the reality is it's not for everyone to either gravitate towards this work, and I suppose that does bring in the whole question around, I suppose, the capacity and sustainability of composers, and how we can maybe develop supports for composers, and Eve might like to come in here on that, but it is something that's at the back of my mind, like how we, the Contemporary Music Centre, can maybe try and develop some supports to help composers who may not be working in this area but who may want to come into working in this area.
Yeah, maybe if I could add something in on that. I think it's a little bit chicken and egg at the moment, in that there isn't all that much that's sort of all that much work that's obviously available for this kind of thing. I mean, you won't see lots of funds being advertised or opportunities or whatever, but at the same time there are people who want to work with composers. So I think we can do something around finding out who's interested in this sort of work, and then bringing them more closely together with the people who might have that kind of work, and just generally getting something kind of circling around that. So maybe something like a register or some kind of icon a composer could put on his or her website, or sort of some easy ways that you don't have to go through 350 composers or whatever it is to find those people. And I think we'd be very interested, after this session, if any of you could maybe communicate with Karen if you are interested in kind of having your name on some kind of a list or something. And also then looking at, are there some kind of upskilling needs out there? Because what I tend to find, certainly in working with the music education partnerships, is that maybe an idea comes up and people tend to say, oh, I'd love to work with so-and-so. And I'm saying, oh yeah, fantastic, so-and-so would be absolutely great. But there's also these other 6 people, have you thought of them? And from the commissioning side then, the feeling tends to be, well, I kind of want my project to go well, so I think I'd rather work with somebody who has the proven skills. But of course that's where the chicken and egg thing comes in then. How do you get into this kind of work? So we really want to broaden that out as well. And it may be that there's some training or facilitation. I mean, we've learned a huge amount from the composers who have spoken this morning, just little practical tips, for instance, but there are just sort of in principle things around that. And I would also say, for any of you who are interested in this work, watch things like the Journal of Music in Ireland, register for both the CMC and the Music Generation regular e-shots, watch all those kind of things, because composers are usually appointed after a tendering process. And so if you're not watching those, you can't be considered.
Just a point on that. What about mentorship, like some sort of structure?
Yes, exactly, and that's something I'd love to see happening. And I've always tried to figure it into, for instance, the Music Generation Arts Council partnership things. The problem tends to be that the projects are happening all around the island, so it can be difficult. Like a composer in Cork may love to shadow a project in Donegal, but it just mightn't be feasible, or vice versa. So again, the more that we jointly as organisations know about the desire for that, the more we can do the matching.
Yeah, and it would seem from listening to the contributions that the real experience is got in the classroom, in the field. So when I'm saying there, what supports can we offer, it's really hard to be offering supports outside of an infrastructure, which means you need a project in place, which means you need a funding in place, and maybe it's a question of trying to build in a little bit of extra funding somewhere that would go into mentoring along with the project. I mean, one thing just to reference as well, which again will be on our website soon, is some resources out of Elaine's project in Wicklow. So Elaine, as I said, was one of the 4 composers, and she worked with 3 schools and a plethora of performers, and the project is entitled Mostly Me, and it had its performance outcome in the Mermaid Art Centre in Bray. And Elaine has fantastically worked on worksheets. So there will be a workbook around Mostly Me, and how she, I suppose, devised those songs with the children. It's the 3 songs from the piece of music in the classroom, and it'll be specifically for music generation tutors to use in classroom settings. But I think, you know, it would be probably very interesting for people who are interested in working in classroom settings to see how the process was for writing those songs and that music and the percussion. The children were all very young. They were between 5 and 8.
First, second, third class.
Yeah, so that's a resource that we will be promoting on our website, and will be coming on stream soon enough. Yeah.
I suppose just in terms of mentoring and having opportunities for composers to be mentored by other composers, you know, if it's established, as it seems to be here today, that there is a real appetite among composers to have mentoring opportunities, I think that's something that will probably commissioners thinking of projects will, you know, it'll be and not to be kind of thought of afterwards when it's kind of a bit too late then to incorporate that into it. So if we can establish that there's a clear appetite for it, then I'm sure that will be something that every commissioner can take on board and just make it an integral part of the project, rather than an afterthought, which sometimes it is when it's not known, you know, the appetite.
Exactly. That's a great idea.
I just say, my name is Una Keane. I'm a composer, and I also very, very interested in all of this. I'm really impressed by the Sligo project. The opportunity for kids to be involved with an orchestra, I think, is amazing. I'm just working on an album of piano compositions now. I was lucky enough to have time over at the Irish Cultural Centre over the last year. I've gone over 4 times in Paris. But it's my first album, and it's taken me a little while to see myself as a composer, so that's great. I've also been involved in music education for the last 12 years. I set up a small music school in Kilmainham just down the road called the Piano Room, and we are now 4 people working with me, and we've over 80 to 90 young people learning piano, classical guitar, singing, but it's very creative. Everybody who works with me is either a composer or is involved as a creative person, and we've been able to have 2 concerts in the National Concert Hall at Donald Field Room. And I also run a creative arts camp in Inchicore College the last 10 years, and a big part of that will be what Elaine has been talking about, is really getting kids involved in writing and creating and not putting any labels. But it's been really interesting just hearing what's going on, because I suppose I've been doing my own thing as a teacher, a Department of Education teacher, although I come from that background at home, so many teachers in my family. But it's just thank you very much everybody who's spoken, and I'd be very interested in opportunities, although very busy, but I just like the idea of linking in with community in terms of schools. I didn't realise these kind of projects took place. I think there is an appetite for sure. Maybe talk to Elaine.
I suppose, you know, the philosophy that you were speaking about, learning by doing for the children, it's kind of the same for all of us in whatever environment we're in, you know. You learn so much by just shadowing someone, and you know, it's the same philosophy.
It comes out.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think for the composer here is like the lead facilitator would love to have a fellow composer in I just love that.
Sort of a team approach.
Because they're bringing in ideas, and even though maybe one is the lead and one's maybe more of a shadow, but I think that's a really great opportunity again for both.
That puts the structure then on unheard people becoming heard about people. Commissioners can confidently commission them because they assisted on the last one and so on.
Exactly. I mean, we're all the same, you know, if we're looking for somebody to, I don't know, you know, fix the roof or something, we tend to ask like, they fixed your, they were good at that.
He was regular.
Exactly. So, you know, we do need to broaden it out, because I know there are people around who would be excellent at the work, and it's just making those introductions. And also just to say that you'll find quite a lot of really nice video examples on the Music Generation website from projects like this, and on the Facebook pages of the different partnerships, as well as the Arts in Education site. And no doubt the CMC site from the Wicklow projects and so on. So if you just want to, you know, just seeing a snippet of the work in progress is, I think one learns
classroom. I'd love to see composers, if they have time to do a weekly program, to apply to be on the music tutor panels for the different partnerships, because we have a big schools program in Sligo where we go in and it's instrumental or vocal tuition, and it's a 26-week program. So our tutor goes in and there's kind of a half an hour of activities and theory, and then there's teaching the instrument, whether it's the keyboard or the cello or the violin or the recorder. But when I have a composer section, so I think schools would love that as an option. Just say tick the box that we'll do a year of composing. So if there was a composer, that would, it'd be great to see that. And I'm not aware that there are really that many composers on panels.
Well, we are. Yeah, I was going to just follow on from what Rona said.
Music Generation.
My name is Paula from Music Generation Carlow, and our composition work in Carlow over the last 3 years hasn't been anything to do with the Arts Council partnership. So it's something that's happened from the ground up, I suppose. But what I am interested in, which links to what Rona has said, and if we're thinking of developing models of best practice or effective practice, is the question of what's next. So, we've done projects in Carlow, but the idea around how does composition become more than just a project and an experience on a one-off experience. It might be over a period of time, but that's it. So how does it become more mainstream from the young people, and especially if they've had a really positive experience and they're looking to compose on a more regular basis? How does that happen, and how does it not become just a one-off experience for them, so that they take whatever it is they've learned and what we've all learned in the process, and that becomes a more regular music making performance opportunity for them. We don't have a weekly event around composition in Carlow, but we do have a Young Composers Club that have met monthly or fortnightly actually for the last 2 years, and that came out of a project that happened with Linda Buckley. So I think that the what's next is very important, and it's something that I would be really interested at looking long term for and with the young people in Carlow.
I think that raises really important questions for approaches to pedagogy across vocal and instrumental learning. If you take, if you've been trained classically and you go through the grades and so on and so forth, and you do your musicianship and your theory and your ensemble, composition isn't something that you've grown up with necessarily in that approach. And in many projects that I was involved in previous roles that I held, we kind of challenged that whole notion of using composition as a way to educate musicianship, as opposed to composition just being a project that you were involved in. So I think your question, Paula, raises questions for the breadth of vocal and instrumental tuition, and to what extent can composition be a central part of the experience of educating musicianship in the holistic sense. I think that it raises that particular question. Second thing, it's just an observation. Sometimes when we talk about composers and composition, that language is very much aligned to classical music and classical approaches to pedagogy. But composition, is it the same thing as songwriting, as rapping, as whatever it is? So when we talk about composition, it's not necessarily aligned to any one genre. We're spanning all genres of music and all approaches to making and creating music in many different ways. So with that, just going back then to the question that I was prompted to ask from what Paula said, that word composition and how intrinsic it is linked to the approaches to teaching and learning of music across genres. If you're a grassroots musician and you're a young person and you're writing your own music and teaching yourself how to figure out chords or whatever it is, that's a very valid way of composition, in music education as well. So I suppose it's how can the diverse approaches to teaching and learning capture all of the experiences that children and young people have in that very broad word that is composition. So it's just it's a different way to think about it, perhaps.
Yeah, so I think we're coming to the end now, but I just wanted to reference two things that I should have mentioned earlier. We do have a hashtag, but it's a way of keeping in touch in the days and weeks to follow. So it's Best Practice Music Ed, ED. And many thanks to Leanne here from CMC and Aoife from Music Generation for keeping all the social media alive around today's event and keeping it going afterwards, I'm sure. We also did trial live streaming for the first time in CMC, and many thanks to Jonathan as well for that. And it's on YouTube /CMC Ireland /live. It stays up there. So if you want to look back at yourself, or if you want to re-listen to anything, it stays there, you know. So it's there, and there were many people who couldn't come, the very nature of it being during kind of times when people teach and who are working in education in different capacities. So I know that there were going to be people dipping in and out of that today. So that's great that we were able to accommodate that. And CMC is delighted to be continuing this conversation with Music Generation and with Music Network, and we will, after today, look at, as we were saying, developing those guidelines and having something which we can circulate to you and make available publicly. So if there is anything that you would like to communicate to us on in relation to that, feel free to email whoever your if you've been in touch with me, email me, or if you've been in touch with Eve or Deirdre or anyone in any of the organisations, your thoughts, because we will regroup on it, and it would be great to have any input. So thank you all very much for coming, and I just want to thank everyone else in CMC who helped with today. Thanks a lot.
Very much. Very interesting.